Hi everyone, and welcome to the new episode of Martin Center Thinking Talks. In this episode, we are going to discuss about the impact that EU sanctions have on Russian economy. I'm Anna Nalyvayko, project officer at the Martin Center, and I'm joined today by Vladimir Milov, who is Russian opposition leader and research associate at Martin Center. Welcome, Vladimir.
Thank you. Pleasure.
We are almost a year into the war that Russia brought onto Ukraine and Europe, and in this time span, the EU has imposed 9 sanction packages on the Russian Federation. These measures include individual sanctions. They hit financial and banking institutions, companies that deal with the defense and military sector, political parties, media holdings, etc. The aim, of course, of these measures is to undermine Russia's capacity to wage war against Ukraine. However, the data that are coming from the Kremlin suggests something else. The Kremlin is telling us that the Russian economy is not doing that badly, that Russia is still getting massive profits from the export of fossil fuels, and that the GDP has not declined that much. Vladimir, you have wrote a publication for the Martin Center a few months ago, Beyond the Headlines, the real impact of Western sanctions on Russia. So can you tell us what is the state of Russia's economy today, and to what extent did sanctions achieve their goal?
Sanctions are having a very serious, profound impact on the Russian economy, and I think many of the economic commentators are falling for a Kremlin's trick. They just pick a handful of misleading macro indicators like GDP, which you mentioned, but if you really look deeper, and this is what I try to do exactly in this paper, if you really look deeper at cross-sectoral picture, many detailed indicators of the Russian economy, you will see a very, very different situation. And for instance, wartime GDP is tricky. It's misleading because it also counts all this increased military production, which does not produce any multiplier for the rest of the economy, like a battle tank, which is produced and shot down by Ukrainian Javelin, is still counting as a positive contribution to GDP. Or if you look at the industrial output, the absolute champion of increased production last year was uniforms. Now, we saw those uniforms actually rotting in battlefields in Ukraine. So, or take unemployment, for instance. Putin is boasting about record low unemployment, which is below 3%, but as a matter of fact, if you really look at hidden unemployment, all these forms of unpaid leave or downtime or part-time working week, that's almost 5 million people. So if you sum up official unemployment figure with all these forms of hidden unemployment, it will be over 10% of the workforce. We had this level of unemployment only for a few years in the middle of 90s. That was the worst case. So I illustrate all this detailed picture in my report, and I hope we'll be doing some updates in the coming months. And as a matter of fact, different indicators like retail trade, cargo, transport, turnover, or non-oil and gas revenue of the budget, which indicates the taxes paid by all of the rest of the economy beyond oil and gas, that shows a contraction of economic activity 5 to 10% roughly. And the situation is worsening over time. 2023 will be a very difficult year because this oil surplus will be gone. Oil embargo is in effect. The Russian Ministry of Finance reported in the first weeks of New Year that Ural's oil price went below $50 per barrel. And the cost of shipping oil to Asia is significantly higher. You can easily add more than $10 per barrel extra costs. So Russia will be out of money. There's already a significant budget deficit that will be worsening. So yes, sanctions are having very serious impact. We just need to look into detail and be patient.
You mentioned Asia. Could potentially Asia be Putin's economic salvation?
There was another detailed paper which I wrote for the Martin Center a little over a year ago. Why Russia-China economic cooperation is not truly working as Putin would want it to. There is not so much economic gravity between the two countries, and China or India, they are fundamentally interested only in getting cheap resources from Russia at discount. But they're not interested in helping Russia emerge as a major manufacturing competitor at global markets. You can look, for instance, to an attempt of, Russia-China joint venture to build a wide-body passenger jet, CR-929 airplane. It was announced a decade ago, and last year Russian Deputy Prime Minister Borisov effectively admitted that is going nowhere because the Chinese really don't want to share the technology with the Russians, don't want to allow Russians to do the marketing in China itself. So as a matter of fact, this high-tech project has collapsed. We see successful cooperation only in effectively selling cheap oil, gas, roundwood and all other raw materials to Asia with discounts. That's the only direction where Russia is really achieving anything with Asia.
Let us talk about a specific episode that happened last year in September 2022. There was an announcement made by the Kremlin about a partial mobilization. And as a result, we have seen hundreds of thousands of men fleeing Russia to go to neighboring countries to escape the mobilization. We don't have any official figures, of course, from Russia, but Western media reported around 700,000 people leaving Russia in a very short time span. Now tell us, what are the implications on the economy of such a massive exodus of people in working age leaving the country at once?
Very serious. If you look at any survey of Russian business, they would indicate a shortage of skilled workforce as like top 3, top 4 major problems impeding development and operations. Or alternatively, you can go listen to press conferences of Elvira Nabiullina, the chairman of the Russian Central Bank. Since the mobilization was announced in September, she's been constantly mentioning it as a very harmful factor to the economy, adding shortages to skilled labor market, and mentioning this as a pro-inflationary factor, because obviously labor costs will go up when there's a deficit of skilled workforce. It's really hard to measure at the moment, but we do have some data. For instance, Sberbank at the end of the year had estimated the deficit of specialists in cybersecurity field as 100,000, shortage of positions. A year ago, it was estimated only as 20,000. So we see a 5-fold increase. And Putin, before the mobilization was announced in summer, Putin recognized that the deficit of specialists in the IT sector by 2024 will reach 1 million people in Russia. Clearly, this figure went up significantly, and the Russian Digital Ministry had admitted that about 10% of IT specialists altogether left Russia since the war began. So the deficit of skilled workforce will begin to bite, for the Russian economy is biting already.
Yet again, and correct me if I'm wrong, there wasn't really a massive protest or outcry against the regime following the announcement of the mobilization, as many in the West were hoping for or were waiting for. We know that until now, Putin has avoided sending wealthier ethnic Russians to war, but now there are talks of a new potential mobilization coming, somewhere from 500,000 to 1.5 million conscripts. If that's true, do you expect any massive reaction coming from the Russian society, considering also the repressions that are going on? What will happen once, Putin will stop sending only poorer soldiers from Dagestan or very remote regions in Siberia to the front line, but will also start sending the middle-income Russians to war? And what also does it say about the status of the Russian military?
Well, first, on the mobilization, I think we can clearly see signs of new major waves of mobilization coming. Preparations at conscription centers, training centers, they really preparing to accommodate a lot of new incoming recruits. However, I think politically it will be difficult for Putin because there was a major backlash in September, first in terms of public opinion. Support for Putin significantly plunged, and he doesn't like that. He's very, very concerned about his holy, sacred approval rating, which is why I think he will be careful and maybe not really announcing this all-out mobilization, everybody to front, and so on. I think so when we're speaking about protests, it's important to look at what happened before the war. Because in the previous year, 2021, Russian organized opposition was totally destroyed. Alexei Navalny is in jail for over 2 years now, and everybody else was either jailed or exiled. So protests can only be spontaneous, which is why it was not visible, neither after the 24th of February in the immediate aftermath, nor after mobilization. I mean, well, you can't, if the rallies, if the protests are not organized, you can't get a picture of this massive crowd on Manezhny Square in Moscow. And obviously many of the journalists have left, so there's nobody to report what's really going on. So people actually see no point when there's no proper organization, opposition is jailed or exiled. People see no point coming alone, but there is a huge demand. We see it. We have significant feedback from the Russian audiences. There is growing demand for opposition in exile to actually stage massive rallies. So I think it will be coming in 2023. It's difficult to do because of the crackdown, but people want to protest. You will see it coming.
Let's talk about another thing that didn't exactly go according to Putin's plan. And I'm talking about the fact that he was hoping to capitalize on the fact that at some point EU citizens would demand their respective governments to put a stop on sanctions because of the backlash that the sanctions were also having on the EU's economy. Of course, we know they don't only have a negative impact on Russian economy, but also on EU member states. We have seen a huge inflation, a massive rise in energy costs. However, a new Eurobarometer poll that was released just a few weeks ago shows that more than 2/3 of EU citizens do support EU's response to Russian actions, including sanctions. So it looks like the sanctions are there to stay, even though at some times it looks like the EU is losing a bit of momentum. But what would be the social and political implications of long-term sanctions on the Russian Federation and specifically on Putin's regime?
If you really look back at what happened with Putin's approval, with the support for the authorities in the past 20 plus years when Putin was in power, over time support always receded. So Putin was only able to revitalize it, injecting some super drugs like annexations, wars, and so on. But the trend is very clear. Public gets exhausted. Promises unfulfilled. On the background of that, situation is significantly worsening. Like since the annexation of Crimea 9 years ago, Russians on average became about like 20% poorer in terms of real disposable income by all objective merits. And it's not getting any better. There is no positive economic prospect. Any nation will have hard time withstanding that. Russians really are asking these questions when things are going to normalize, as we were promised many times before. So the exhaustion will come. Putin really is aimed at fighting the war of attrition. You mentioned Western public opinion. He still counts on that. He counts that the Western public opinion will get exhausted and people will demand normalization with Russia for the sake of economic benefits and so on. But as a matter of fact, he has the same problem at home. Because the trends in Russian public opinion, they're not too fast yet, but they are also very clear. Putin's support is receding. And the more economic difficulties will progress over time, the more this trend will accelerate. We saw it in the previous decades, and there is no other way around.
I have one last question for you. Poland and Lithuania are calling for the European Union to pass the 10th package of sanctions in the Council in February, including hitting Belarus with tougher punitive measures and hitting the Russian nuclear sector. Do you think this is heading in the right direction?
Absolutely. And I think it is a mistake that Belarus was forgotten in this recent sanctions packages. All focus was on Russia, but Belarus is an accomplice. Lukashenko's regime is an accomplice to aggression against Ukraine. Plus, there are important sectors which have not been hit by sanctions yet. Rosatom, non-ferrous metals, and diamonds, and so on. And I think one more important issue which we should really talk about, and I also talk about in this paper, the relative success of Putin so far was circumventing the sanctions through a number of third countries which have not joined. Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Kazakhstan and others. He's been really successful in getting access to sanctioned goods like semiconductors, technology products and others. So I think at this moment probably the priority should be shifting from adopting new packages to making sure that the previous sanctions are fully enforced and Turkey and other countries are not helping Putin evade it.
Well, thank you so much, Vladimir. Thank you for your time and thank you for your insights.
Thank you to everyone for tuning in to this episode of Thinking Talks. This was our conversation with Vladimir Milov, a Russian opposition leader and the research associate at the Martin Center. If you found this dialogue interesting, you can head to our website to read more publications by Vladimir Milov and other authors. and follow us for more updates. See you soon.